YouTube. And with that, we begin our morning shir. And the name of today's class is Step Up to the Plate. Punching above your weight is indeed a solid strategy. Oh, here we are. Sorry, I didn't see you. So that's today's discussion. We're going to talk, of course, we're looking at the weekly parsha. We're going to look at the weekly parsha to. Sorry, Sheila, if you don't mind.
I'm muted, Mom.
So the purpose, the idea of today's class. Just a second. Where did we go? I'm looking for our broadcast just to see. There we are. Okay. Just got to open up the broadcast so that those who are watching us online on the other platforms can participate as well. And give it a minute. As soon as they are on, we will begin. All right. So that's the name of today's discussion. And I'd love to hear your perspective. We're going to look at some lessons, some messages from the weekly portion this week. In fact, why don't we start off with just taking a look. First of all, it's Rosh Chodesh today, so Chodesh Tov to everyone. It should be a good month for all of us, a month of healing. You know that ER is an acronym for Ani Hashem Rofecha, I am God, your healer. And indeed, we recognize that all healing and a lot of healing is needed for the world these days comes from Hashem. So that's today, Rosh Chodesh. If you know anyone who needs healing, please have them in mind, and we dedicate the shir to all those who need a speedy recovery. But besides for being Rosh Chodesh today, apologies for those who are joining us online. Give me a minute. I think my multitasking is getting me into trouble here. I'm doing two things at once. So give it a second while I try to get this right. Just a moment. Okay. So besides for that, we got a double parsha this week. Not only do we read the portion of Tazria, we also read Metzora. And let's take a moment to see what it's about. Let's just analyze a little bit of it, and then I will try to put up some slides as I try each day, just to give us some insights, some ways of understanding and discussing the parsha. Again, shoot, it's unmuted. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. So if you could just keep an eye on that. Now, the two parshas of Tazria Metzora, just to summarize them, they're a continuation of the discussion of the laws of Tuma Vatara, ritual impurity and purity, which we previously discussed. These are called chukim, statutes. These are laws that are beyond our comprehension. These aren't laws that make sense to us, why a person becomes in contact with ritual purity or impurity, how a person becomes impure. Does that make sense? Sheila, I don't know why you keep getting unmuted. Now, for example, a woman gives birth to a baby. The Torah says in this week's portion that she has to go through a process of purification, which includes immersing in a mikvah, right? Bringing a korban, an offering to the Beis Hamikdash, to the Holy Temple. And all male infants are to be circumcised on the 8th day of life. That's again in this week's parsha. So we have a very interesting mixture, a combination of various laws. And the name Tazria Metzora talks about the infliction of tzarat. Now, a lot of people often call that leprosy. It is some kind of a skin disease, but it wasn't a physical disease. It was a spiritual disease with a physical manifestation. It was a completely super rational kind of affliction, right? And of course, considering that it could afflict people, it could afflict clothing, it could afflict the home. And if there was this white or pink color that was detected, that appeared on the person's skin, okay, or a dark green in a person's garment or in their home, then you had to go to the doctor. Who was the doctor? A Kohen. The Kohen was the one who had to determine if indeed it was actually tzarat. Why a Kohen? Says the Medrash, because a Kohen inherently was merciful. And being merciful, it's a very important part of detecting you. Before we determine that someone else is rich, is spiritually imperfect, or I shouldn't say imperfect, we're all imperfect. But before determining that somebody's got a malady, one has to have that midah, that attribute of compassion, of care, of kindness. So the Kohen then would pronounce if the person was tameh, was impure, or if they were indeed tahor, they were pure and not a problem. Now, a person afflicted with tzarat, again relevant to our current circumstances, had to quarantine, had to dwell outside of the camp or the city until they were healed. The afflicted area, if it was a garment or the home, actually the house would be demolished. They would remove the bricks. The Medrash says that in that case, they would often find treasures. What is that symbolic of? That sometimes when we go through difficulties, through challenges, through struggles in our life, we hit a down. We have to realize failure is not getting knocked down. Failure is only if we stay down. And if we get back up again, remember that song, I get knocked down, but I get up again. Remember that when we get back up again, we discover those treasures that are inside of ourselves. We discover things we previously didn't even realize we had. So when the Matzorah, when this person was healed, there was a whole procedure, and this is what I want to talk about today. It involved 2 birds, and there was spring water in an earthen vessel, and a piece of cedar wood, and a scarlet thread, and a bundle of hyssop. I'm not a botanist, so I don't know exactly the purpose of the hyssop and all that, but we are going to learn today a more spiritual idea. And also, sometimes I have very, very powerful messages. Today, I think it's going to be a little bit more of academic, but I do think we're all going to take a great lesson to the idea of punching above our weight, because that is indeed a solid strategy. And I want to get moving into that, because this idea of ritual impurity, it seems beyond our comprehension. It's something we don't understand. And that's what's discussed in the parsha this week. But I want to take a powerful lesson of this. So I welcome you all to join me in this discussion. Let's talk a little bit about it. And of course, at any point, if you have any questions, do feel free to unmute yourself and to interject. I don't mind that at all. But otherwise, just for everyone's sake, if you could keep muted while you don't have any particular points to share, just so it doesn't get distracting. So one of the central themes that we have in our 2 parshas this week is a person who's afflicted with tzarat, which we just discussed a little bit. And while a lot of people call this leprosy, tzarat was, although it was a skin disease, the Talmud attributes it to lashon hara, to speaking gossip, to speaking slanderously about another. My mother of blessed memory used to say, the gossip is like film. It always begins with a negative. It's usually developed and sometimes even enlarged. Well, we discussed how it could affect a person, their clothing, their home, because as the commentaries explain, it wasn't a physiologically occurring disease. Yes, it had a physical manifestation, but it was a spiritual malady coming from arrogance and gossip, lashon hara. And for this reason, the cure for tzaras was not some kind of a dermatological skin cream that you went and got from your dermatologist, right? It wasn't something you got from your doctor, but it was a special purification process that's prescribed by the Torah in this week's parsha, designed to lead a person to become more spiritually healthy. That's what we want. That's the goal. That's the purpose. So today, in our remaining 45 minutes or so, I want to discuss with you, I want to explore how the process works. Because after all, we don't want to only talk here things that we all know. We want to learn ideas that we don't necessarily know, that we're not necessarily familiar with. And that's why I try to find, and by the way, anytime you have a particular topic you want to discuss, please feel free to message me or to tell me at the end of the shiur, and I will do some research and try to put together a shiur based on your particular requests. Otherwise, we'll keep it related to the parsha and some other things. And we are starting an evening course next week, please God, on Wednesdays, about Mashiach. We talk so much about Mashiach. What is Mashiach? What's it about? Who needs Mashiach, right? So we'll talk about that, please God, starting Wednesdays next week in the evenings. We're going to start a whole brand new, interesting, fascinating exciting new course that I hope you join me for. So let's talk about the lessons we could learn from this, but we're going to get legal, we're going to get technical, and bear with me. Please don't disappear just because we're getting technical. Feel free to ask your questions. Now, you or someone you know thinks you might have tzaras, God forbid, okay? Because it's only normal. I mean, normal, I shouldn't say it's normal, but what do we talk about at our Shabbos tables? By the way, my Shabbos table, we have a policy, no Lashon Hara. But, you know, we have two things we don't talk about, religion or politics, right? But if you're going to talk about those things, inevitably, Lashon Hara is going to come up. God forbid, somebody gets inflicted with tzaras. Who do you call? So we discussed, you call the Kohen, right? And the parsha talks about it, only a qualified Kohen is authorized to examine this skin lesion, or if it's on the home or the garments, to determine if indeed it is tzaras. So imagine back, today you got to go for COVID testing. Back then, you had to go for tzara testing. Now, there are many intricate laws in our parsha to discuss the different types of lesions that could be definitively pronounced as tzarat, and when it can be conclusively declared as non-tzarat is a person tested positive, are they negative, right? When the individual has to be quarantined for 7 days, all the different rules, the regulations. Is it a false negative? Is it a false positive? All that stuff. We think of COVID diagnosis these days. Well, tzaras had its own diagnosis in those days. And if a person indeed was found to have tzaras, God forbid, then they have to, Sheila, let's keep that muted. Thank you. Then they have to do, the Metzora has to go outside the camp. Quarantine, don't we all know what quarantine is for the past year, right? Or outside of the city if they lived in Jerusalem. And they remained alone for as long as the tzaras was on them. And when they believe that they are cured, okay, so you're no longer feeling the symptoms, right? If it's corona, you know that you no longer have whatever the symptoms are. You're getting your smell back, you're getting your taste back. Okay, maybe not that long. You're feeling better, right? So the Kohen is called to visit the person called the Metzora outside the camp if they were in the wilderness in the first 40 years of the Jewish journey after Egypt unto Israel, or when they lived in Israel outside of their home. And if the tzaras is determined to have been healed, then what happens? We read in the parsha this week, the Torah says, Zos tia Torah Samatzara. If you want to open up a chumash, you could open up to this week's parsha. I'm sorry I did not include the texts along with the slides, but you can follow along. Let me just get the slide on the proper slide. Okay, this is our question. What's the symbolism behind the purification process from tzaras? And what I'm going to do first is to read to you the parsha this week. And if you have a chumash in front of you, please feel free to open chumash. Where did my chumash go? I had it sitting here on my desk, and it seems to have disappeared. How do you like that? Don't you love it when your chumash disappears from your desk? Where could it have gone? This is a little bit funny. Okay. I'm going to have to make usage of the chumash on my phone. Wonder who borrowed it. Someone must have been in my office in the last 2-3 days and decided to take my chumash. Arachita sitting here. Okay, that's very strange. All right, I'll deal with the investigations later. You don't have to worry about that. For now, let me just pick up the chumash. That's the wonderful, beautiful aspect of our phones, is that right here, I got a chumash. I just click on this. It's a wonderful app I've got. And here my chumash pops up. I got it right here in front of me. So let's just read the chumash of this week's parsha right here. It says, Zois tia Torah Samatzara. This shall be the law of a person afflicted with tzaras, the Yom Tarasa on the day of his cleansing. We're now fast forwarding to the cleansing process. What does the Torah say? Should be brought to the Kohen. The Yatsa Hakana Mechutz Lamachana. The priest should go outside the camp, because don't forget, when these rules were being given, Moshe, the Jewish people, were all then in the wilderness, and they encamped with each other. And the Metzora, this person afflicted with tzarat, had to go outside the camp. And this is the procedure. The priest should look, examine, and behold, the lesion of tzaras is healed in the afflicted person. Then the priest shall order, and the person to be cleansed shall take 2 live, clean birds. Are you listening? We're going to do exactly this, what the Torah portion says. They're going to take 2 birds, okay, again, kosher birds, that's what it means by clean, and a cedar stick, all right? Let's read the instructions first. And a strip of crimson wool and hyssop, okay? The priest shall order, and one shall slaughter the one bird into an earthenware vessel over spring water. As for the live bird, he shall take it, and the cedar stick, the strip of crimson wool, and the hyssop, and along with the live bird, he shall dip them into the blood of the slaughtered bird over the spring water. He shall then sprinkle 7 times upon the person being cleansed from tzara'at, and he shall cleanse him. He shall then send away the live bird into the open field. That is the basic verses I wanted to read to you. Now, let's try to understand how, the sages explain how each aspect of this process, the cedar stick, the crimson wool, the hyssop, the birds, the water, all these things that the Torah says here, actually reference to the Metzorah's malady. They're the cause of the symptoms, which led to the situation in the first place, and what is the antidote? You go to a doctor, the doctor tells you, well, the reason why a person's not well is because this and this and the other, and this is what you have to do to remedy it. Besides for medication, and perhaps you should take some kind of, what do they call, preventive medicine. What is this about, right? What is it all about? What's the symbolism behind this purification that we just read in these verses? So let's just think about these days. There's a lot of chit chat going on. Anyone here on social media? One of, President Trump, whether you like him or not, is irrelevant. He was kicked off of one of the world's biggest social media platforms these days called Twitter. Right? The loudest symbolism that you could have. Why is it called Twitter? And what's its symbol? Birds. Okay, that is the symbolism of Twitter. It's birds tweeting, because that's exactly what birds do. They go around making their noises, right? So this is the problem of the Metzorah. What is his problem? What has he done wrong? The Metzorah's pride, that arrogance, too much lashon hara, too much gossip. And this is what Rashi tells us, that like birds that like to chirp. So the Torah reminds us that tweets and chirps, they might be fine for a bird, but for a person, there's more expected. It's not virtuous to just blurt out everything that comes to our minds. We're not birdies. We don't have to constantly be chirping, and talking about every nonsense and talking about other people. What do they say? Great people talk about ideas. Mediocre people talk about things. And small people like to talk about other people. Let's not underestimate how good we are. We don't have to constantly be talking about people, but that is the problem of the Metzorah, that he or she might be talking too much. A yente, they call them in Yiddish. You heard that term, yente? Right? So the birds that we have here in the Metzorah's purification process reminds us that they're like a bird. And that's why part of the recovery, part of the rectification process is birds that are offered as sacrifices, because the mindless chit-chat, all that gossip, all that lashon hara. Eleanor Roosevelt once said that idea that we have to, that idea of great minds talking about ideas, let's find good things to talk about. What's the cedar stick about? The cedar stick functions in the same way. Cedars are proud, right? They're tall, upright trees. So it's when people are too proud and upright that they begin to talk about other things and irrelevant topics. Let's be careful about what we talk about. Says Rashi in our parsha. Let me just pick up Rashi quickly. Rashi says, why does it say to Horus, why clean birds? Why are birds required for this cleansing rite altogether? Because lesions of tzaras result from lashon hara. This is what Rashi tells us. That's why the cleansing process also requires that. And the same thing he explains is about the cedar stick coming from a tall tree. And perhaps it's a symbolism of haughtiness, of pride. We come from Pesach. Pesach is all about learning to be a little bit more humble. Matzah is flat bread, whereas bread is inflated. It's about learning to be humble, about applying that aspect of humility in our lives. And of course, the Torah doesn't just focus on the negative, right? The purification process is not just about pointing out what the Mitzvah has been doing wrong. The Torah is offering us guidance, what we should do right in the future. So that's the function of the crimson wool and the hyssop, which symbolize the humility. Let's look at Rashi for a second. Rashi talks about this. Rashi says, what's this idea of the strip of crimson wool and the hyssop? Asks Rashi, Ma takanta b'yisrapa, what is the remedy so that he can be healed? We can't just focus, the doctor can't just tell a patient, this is your problem. Half the remedy is knowing that one's sick. But now we have to know what's the cure, right? Well, how do you fix this malady? Says Rashi, this is what the Torah tells us. He has to humble himself from his haughtiness. Like the worm which infested the berries from which the crimson dye was extracted to color the wool and the lowly hyssop. So here Rashi is telling us what? Rashi is saying that the whole process is making sense out of the process. When the Kohen binds the bird, the wool, the cedar, and the hyssop, the Mitzvah is being reminded that healing comes from abandoning our ego, from focusing instead on humility. Now, humility, which we discussed in previous classes here, humility does not mean you have to become like a rug on the floor. There is healthy humility, which includes even healthy ego, recognizing what kind of pride is important. They tell a story about a man who was known for blurting out whatever came to his mind. And unfortunately, it wasn't only, what do you say, just benign prattle that came out of his mouth. It was a little bit haughty. He was very opinionated. And he thought very highly of himself and not so highly of others. And unfortunately, his many words, his chirps, his tweets wound up hurting other people. So one day he decided that he wants to fix his ways. He didn't know what to do. So he went to his rabbi. He said, Rabbi, please give me a tikkun. Give me some advice. What can I do to rectify my hurtful actions? And the rabbi said, if you want to learn to take control of your mouth, then take a pillow, a nice feathery pillow, one of those down pillows. And I want you to go to the top of Santon City, Carlton Tower. And I want you to open up that pillow and let all the feathers fly out. Let them fly all over Santon. The man says, okay, fine. That sounds interesting. I'll go do it. And he did exactly that. Now he came to the rabbi. He says, I followed your advice. What now? The rabbi said, well, you're not done. Now you have to go back to the streets and you have to collect every last feather that came out of the pillow. Now, of course, that's not exactly something realistic or practical. And in fact, it's an arduous task and probably impossible. And the man turned to the rabbi and said, how could I ever do that? It's impossible to pick up every last feather. They've flown all over the place. Once they've flown away, there's no way I could go get them back. Ah, said the rabbi, exactly is the point. Your words are exactly like those feathers. Remember that once they leave your mouth, you can never take them back. And I want you to keep that in mind when you speak, and you'll find it easier to control what you say. Once the students of the Baal Shem Tov, he sent them off on a mission. He sent them go to a particular restaurant to eat. Okay, your rabbi sends you to a restaurant for lunch. What do? Go to the restaurant. But when they came into this restaurant, they were a little bit suspicious. They saw the proprietor, as much as the Baal Shem Tov sent them there, he didn't look so religious. He didn't look so pious. They weren't sure. They started, chit-chatting amongst themselves. And they were saying, you think we could eat here? You think we could trust the kashrut of this establishment? So while the proprietor was getting the food ready, he turned to them and he said, I see you're very concerned about what's going to come into your mouth. I wish you were as careful about the words that come out of your mouth, because those words are hurtful. And then they understood why the Baal Shem Tov sent them there. Because it's very good and important that we be careful about our kashrut. Obviously, if the Holy Baal Shem Tov sent his students to eat at this place, he trusted the kashrut. But he wanted them to learn this lesson, that as careful as we are about what comes in our mouths, we have to be as careful about what goes out of our mouths. So with that in mind, let's try to understand. We talked about the bird. They symbolize this mindless chirping that led the Metzora to become, to this whole predicament where he's now with the infliction of Tzarat. So it would seem that the first bird, remember there's two birds. The first bird, which is slaughtered, is teaching us to do away with that idle chatter, right? Don't speak Lashon Hara. Don't be a gossip monger. But what's the point of the second bird? For what? First of all, why isn't one bird enough to get the point across? Why two birds? I know we Jews say if it's free, take two. But guess what? It wasn't free. You had to pay the person, not you per se, but the person who was afflicted with Tzarat had to purchase these birds and had to offer them had to bring them as an offering in the temple. So what was the point of it? Besides the point, the first bird was slaughtered, was brought as an offering. But the second bird was sent away. We really don't do anything with it. So what purpose does it have? Buy two birds, one you're bringing as an offering, the other one you send away to fly away. For what reason? So I want to share with you a profound insight from the Kli Yakar. The Kli Yakar is a very famous commentator from medieval Spain, I think he lived during the time of the Inquisition or thereabout. And he points out a wonderful message about the power of speech, which the Metzora and all of us who read the Parsha this week have to internalize in order to truly heal. And if we want to bring healing to our world, I think there's a message relevant to you and me, to each one of us. You see, when the Metzora is admonished by seeing the slaughter of the chirping bird, then they might think, they might reach an unfortunate conclusion. If my words of Lashon Hara, if my slander and gossip have hurt so many people, maybe from now on I should simply keep quiet. If I don't say anything, then I can't hurt anyone, right? So rather, keep shtum, zip it. Which is, by the way, according to some commentaries, why we have so many guards around our mouth. We have lips, we have teeth, we have our gums. For what reason? To remind us when it's time to be shtum, when to close it. So in this story where the rabbi tells the guy, to throw away those feathers, the rabbi didn't tell the man to keep quiet because his words could be dangerous. That's not what the rabbi said. He was telling the man that no words are bad. No. It's not that the words are bad, but they're potent. What did they say when we were kids? Sticks and stones could break my bones, but words can't hurt. What nonsense. Of course words can hurt. But like anything in life, anything in this world, depends what you use them for. Money, we can do lots of good things with money. Imagine what we could do with all the charity we give. But money can also be destructive. And the same thing we could apply to all as fire. Fire could keep people warm. Fire could bake and cook. There's so many good things you could do with it. Fire could weld things together. But fire could also be destructive. And the same thing with our words. Words of Torah and prayer, words of praise and thanks, right? That does a lot of good. When they leave our mouth, they can never be taken back. And that's a good thing. If you said something positive, well, like feathers, they're flying gracefully away. Their positive influences reach further and further. It could change the world all for the good. Say good things. In fact, in the morning, we remind ourselves in our prayers, we say, Baruch Sha'amar V'haya Olam, blessed is one who spoke and the world came to be. Or we also remember, Baruch Sha'amar, blessed is you speaks. Each one of us, we speak words. V'haya Ha'olam, we create our environment with our words. We create the world around us. What kind of words are we going to say? Are they going to be positive or otherwise? That's our choice. We decide. And that's why, in fact, God created the world with the faculty of speech. Each one of us creates our environment, our world. If it becomes toxic and unpleasant, it's us who does that. We can change that. Let's be in control of our words. And that's exactly the point of the second bird. The Mitzvah already learned the potency of his words. And now he has to remember to channel that potency by saying the right things. If it was arrogance that led to it, then he has to learn the idea of humility, of grace. So let me share with you the words of the Kli Yakar. Exactly this, he says, is that point that we have to learn. The Mitzvah, the purpose, the Mitzvah has to learn that that's the whole idea of his rectification, of the birds, of the wool, of the cedar, of the hyssop. That after sprinkling the whole procedure, as it's described in our parsha this week, after going to the mikveh, the whole process, he now counts 7 days in which life returns basically to normal, but he's forbidden to engage in intimacy, in marital relations. On the 7th day, he shaves the hair of his body, all the hair of his body, and once again immerses in a mikveh, and his clothing is also immersed in the mikveh. And the process is finally completed the following day when he brings another sacrifice. Let's just read it in the parsha. If you have your own chumash next to you, it is chapter 14 of this week's parsha, verse 10 of Leviticus, Vayikra. Says the Torah, Uvayom HaShemini, on the 8th day, Yikach Shnei Kvasim Tamimim. On the 8th day, he should take, what does he take? 2 unblemished male lambs, v'chavsa achas bashnasa tamima, 1 unblemished ewe lamb in its first year, u'shloisha esronim soles mincha b'lulav hashamen, and 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with olive oil, v'log echad shamen, and 1 log of olive oil. This is all part of his rectification process, okay? So on the 8th day, this is after immersing in the mikvah, that's when the Metzora has to bring the sacrifice. Now the thing is, the Torah tells us, it all depends on his means. Let's try to understand that, okay? There are many offerings in the Torah, and the obligation to bring all of these is on a sliding scale. So the Torah recognizes that all these varieties, could be quite costly. And just because someone can't afford it doesn't mean that they can't rectify, that they can't atone, that they can't fix up their ailment. So what happens? Instead of bringing 2 lambs and a ewe, the poor person gets away with bringing just 1 lamb, what's called a meal offering, okay, discounted to 1/3 the size of the normal Metzora meal offering, and 2 birds. And this is in the parsha this week. The indalu ve'ein yado maseges. If a person's poor and cannot afford these sacrifices, then the Torah describes that he brings these less costly offerings. So we see here that there is a sliding scale. Okay. Now let's say the Metzora finds it very difficult to make the trip to Jerusalem. Remember, many Jews lived distant from Jerusalem, and they couldn't always come to Yerushalayim to offer their sacrifices or to do the pilgrimage and the festivals. Or if a person's cash-strapped or for some other reason they just can't make it there, then a kind person could come along and say, don't worry about it. I like you, and I really want the sacrifice to happen so that your atonement can be complete. Is he allowed to do this? According to halacha, if both parties agree, then a donor may step in, and once this friend promises to bring the offering, then he becomes obligated to fulfill the promise and bring the sacrifice, the offering, on behalf of the Metzora himself. So when the donor completes the sacrifice, that's only then is the Metzora atoned for. Now, think about this. If you are a nice guy, I'm sure we were all dealing with nice, wonderful, friendly people here, right? Ashley, I have a question. Ashley? No? Okay, I'm just going to remute you there. Let's say you're a really nice, wonderful person. Right? You volunteered to help a recovering Mitzvah by bringing the offering on their behalf. Okay. Now, if he's rich and you're poor, you're a senior citizen, you're a pensioner trying to stay afloat. My question is, do you bring the rich person's offering because that's what you've committed to on behalf of this mitzvah, or do you bring a poor person's offering because that's what you could afford? What do? Do you bring what you could afford, or what the person on whose behalf you're offering could afford? Or think of it the other way. If they are poor and you are rich, you saved up for your retirement very well, and you're doing a nice, kind deed, do you get a pass because the obligation that you stepped up to fulfill that poor person's offering, or do you need to pay more because you're rich? Which one is it? What do you say? Anyone want to share your opinion? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I think Hashem knows what you can afford, and then you have to bring what you honestly can afford.
So that's a good point. He's saying you have to bring what you could afford. But the
Yes.
question is, Rosalind, you're rich, please, right? You're wealthy, please God. But you're bringing it on behalf of another person. That person's poor. So do you have to bring the rich person's offering? You're not bringing. It's not because you spoke lashon hara. They spoke.
You are his shaliach, so you got to bring what he can afford.
You bring what they can afford. Okay.
Yeah.
No.
Sheila, what do you say?
I say he must pay more. He's got
He must pay more.
Yeah. He can afford to pay more for his friend.
Okay, good. I wanted to hear different opinions, different perspectives. I like that. Thank you for chiming in. And let me share with you Rambam, Maimonides. I said we're going to get a little bit technical and interesting and interactive here, and I appreciate when you chime in. That's really good. If anyone else has a perspective, please feel free to chime in. So I'm going to put it up on the board in a second. Rambam says, when a rich person says, I take responsibility for the sacrifices of the afflicted person, and the afflicted person was poor, guess what? He must bring the sacrifices of a wealthy man. The person took the vow of, just read it here. Person took the vow. For the person who took the vow has the financial capacity. So Sheila, it seems like Rambam sides with you. If a poor person said, I take responsibility for the sacrifice of the afflicted person, and the afflicted person was wealthy, then he also must bring the sacrifice of a wealthy person. For the person who took the vow obligated himself to bring the sacrifices of a wealthy person. So it seems that according to Rambam, in both cases, you're going to bring the wealthier, the more expensive offering. Now, I really want to try to unpack this and understand what is going on here. What is this? Let's unpack this piece by piece. In the first case, the recovering mitzvah is poor and the donor's rich, right? Here, the donor says he's going to pay according to his own means. So I can understand the wealthy person has to, represent him. But why in both cases do we say, why if you're bringing for the poor person, don't you get a pass? Right?
No.
So this actually comes from the Gemara. And the Talmud says as follows. Let me read it to you in the Gemara. The Gemara says, when one says, I take upon myself the offering of the Mitzvah, if the Mitzvah is destitute, then the one who takes it out brings the offering of a destitute person. Talmud asks, does this apply even when the one who vowed is wealthy? Doesn't the verse state that the less expensive offering is brought only if he is poor? Whereas in this case, he is the one bringing the offering, he's not poor. So the verse teaches us that the leniency of the less expensive offering does not apply when the mitzvah is destitute and the one who vowed on his behalf is wealthy. If you're wealthy, you pay the wealthy price. Okay, but what's the logic? At the end of the day, what did the kind-hearted donor sign up for? Didn't he just, it's for example, anyone here in the property business, you decide that you want to pay somebody's rent this month, okay? You really want to help them out. Somebody who's struggling during Corona, you want to help them out with their rent. And it's like the landlord says, oh, you're rich, pay double rent. Why do you have to pay double rent? The poor person is only obligated, 1,000 rand a month. Why should you pay 2,000? All right? You're just taking on the Mitzorah's obligation. The fact is, if the Mitzorah himself was bringing the offering, he would bring the poor person, the less expensive one. So by stepping in to cover the obligation, how does the donor suddenly become responsible for a more expensive one? Right? Isn't this a compelling question itself? What does everyone think? What are your thoughts? Why does the donor have to bring the most expensive offering?
Well, now I understand, because Hashem says you have to bring according to your hand. And if that's what you've got to bring it.
Okay. So that's certainly a very good point. And let me expand on this question before we answer it. Okay, we'll just expand on it a little bit. The poor person, the Gemara says, if a poor person said, I take the responsibility for the sacrifices of the Matzorah, of the afflicted person, and the afflicted person was wealthy, then you have to bring the offering of the wealthy, right? In both cases, it seems like you always have to bring the wealthier, the more expensive offering. So here the Mitzorah is wealthy and the donor is poor, and the donor brings the offering of a wealthy person. Now, logically, that makes sense because that's what you could afford. But if you say you're taking on that person's position, why do you still have to bring the most expensive offering? Why both ways? Why on both sides? So let's explore a little further, right? The sponsoring person, the donor, is assuming his sacrificial obligation of the other person, right? So it would seem that the donor's obligation should be whatever the Mitzorah's obligation was. So if you're paying someone else's rent, even if you're wealthy, you shouldn't have to pay more, but just because you're wealthy, okay? But I want to share with you an interesting talk from the Rabbi in 1985 where he discussed this, and that's really what I was trying to get to here today with the profound answer that he gave, and I'm going to share with you another perspective, a way of looking at this. Now, obviously, you look at the financial legal component. From this perspective, yes, the donor has committed to fulfilling the financial and legal obligation of the Mitzorah. And that's why it makes sense that they should be able to maybe give the poor persons, right? From this perspective, the donor is doing something similar to covering rent. If you're covering the rent, you should only have to give what that person has to pay. But there's another component here. The spiritual atonement that's achieved by this offering. And this is much more personal than just paying somebody else's rent, fulfilling someone else's obligation. The donor hasn't only assumed the offering, but rather he has bound himself to be the Mitzorah's agent. You're becoming the shliach, the representative. And from this deep soul-based perspective, you're taking the place of the person, right? So the donor is now up to bat because you are representing the person who you're going to bring that offering for. And that makes a big difference. And that really is what it's about. Covering someone else's Mitzorah is not like covering someone else's rent. Spiritually, it's more like here's a good example. Let's put this up. It is like co-signing on a deal. That's what I think that's a better, when you're doing a loan, you're co-signing someone else's bond mortgage. There you're bearing full responsibility for it, right? And guess what? If the bank doesn't get their money, what do? They come after you even though it's not your home. You did it for somebody. By the way, I did that once. I got into trouble. So when you're stepping up to help someone else, you're a full partner in this. Yes, you it's not nice. It doesn't feel good when you all of a sudden get into that trouble. But the point is, you are assuming full responsibility. And what about the reverse case, where the donor is poor, but the recovering Mitzvah is rich? We apply the same logic, right? Should the donor still be responsible only for the less expensive offering? Isn't that what makes sense if you're based on this logic? But here, halacha says the basic legal financial component of the vow is still fully relevant. Even though from a personal atonement perspective, the poor person is now the one representing the rich person, but this is where we say at the end of the day, you agreed to sponsor the other guy's rent, say the rich person needs help with rent, and it's a more expensive rent, well, you're kicking in there, you're representing them, right? So just because it's a poor person paying the rent for the rich person, the landlord's not necessarily going to say, I just absolve you of your obligation. And this is where it gets more mind-blowing to me. If the poor donor were himself the Metzora, the less expensive offering would have been achieved by his own atonement, right? Because he's poor. But now that he's taken the vow to step in to achieve atonement on behalf of someone else who happens to be rich, then it's not enough. He's got to do, because of this vow, the poor person is now considered like the rich person. Now, how does this work, right? How does a vow cause a person to be considered rich? He's still poor financially. Look at his bank statements. But here's a very interesting idea that I think, give it a few more minutes, we'll unpack this idea. It's a discussion in Jewish law in the Talmud, and there's a lot of conversation about this very question. It sometimes happens that people take vows to do things that they're already obligated to do. What happens then? Right? If, for example, someone decides to become more religious and takes a personal vow, from now on, I'm going to put on tefillin every day. Can you make such a vow? Or is this insincere because every Jewish male is obligated already to put on tefillin? So is it really special to say, the Gemara discusses this very idea. How could you take on a vow of something you're already responsible to do? It seems like superfluous, because you can't obligate yourself to do something you're already obligated to do, even if you're not doing it. But the Talmud tells us that such a vow it's a renewed commitment, and it has value as a personal motivator. That has value as a personal motivator. Sometimes we need an extra boost of energy. And when we consciously recommit to a positive behavior, it creates a rope for us to hold on to as we pull ourselves to achieve that commitment. So it becomes even more personal. It allows us to take a greater degree of ownership or responsibility to make sure that that thing gets done. And this is the point, that when the poor donor becomes obligated to bring a more expensive offering, even though he himself will not be obligated to bring that, but he's taking on the responsibility for somebody else, then he's basically, even though he might still be poor, but by taking on a vow, this vow now strengthens and empowers him to actually become rich. And what's really at play here is a very important idea. We're given tremendous strength when we step up to the plate to tackle whatever daunting tasks we have in life. And when we wholeheartedly commit ourselves to help another person, to get involved in any cause, we are creating an opportunity that empowers us, that we could reach greater than ourselves, that we're suddenly able to achieve beyond ourselves. Like this person who kicks in to help the Metzora. You understand this concept? A story that comes to mind of the previous Rebbe was once asked by a Jew named Rabbi Chanan Glazer. He once asked him to sponsor the printing of a booklet, okay? And this was in 1945, when printing was expensive, okay? I mean, I guess you could still say it's expensive. I print books here, I print things, and it still could sometimes be expensive. In fact, I'm working now, hopefully I'm printing a Shavuos guide. If anyone wants to pitch into it, let me know. But the issue with this man was he didn't have the money, okay? Even though he appreciated the cost, but it was out of his reach. But when the Rebbe asked him to step up to the plate and to help with the financial costs of printing this man did what he could, even though it wasn't in his budget. And the previous Rebbe thanked him and blessed him, said, you went beyond your means to help, and God will shower you with blessings, with abundance that are beyond what beyond your current means as well. And I think basically the lesson is that when we step up to the plate to help somebody else, when we get involved in a communal cause, when we are there, whatever it might be, it doesn't always have to mean financially. When we assist another person, then God assists us, and God creates the opportunity. We read last week on Yom Tov the Parsha Aser to Aser, tithe you shall tithe. And our sages tell us from that, what's the double expression, tithe you shall tithe? Sages express Aser, which means to tithe, is related to Asher, you'll become wealthy. And so when we help others, we ourselves are helped too. You know, those words that are, what do they call a palindrome? The word venasanu, to give, is spelled backward and forward like race car. And what happens is when you give, you get back so much more. And so the new vow, when you help someone else, it helps you too. And because of the commitment, the donor is empowered. And that's why this donor is obligated. But there's a blessing from above for the donor. And this applies to so many aspects. Of course, it's in this week's parsha about the Mitzvah. But I think it's teaching us a very important, powerful lesson in our own lives as well. That when we help others, when we're there to assist somebody else, when we commit to assist somebody else, then we are on a whole new level. And God will help us as well. So what's the message and lesson for all of us? When we see someone like the story in our parsha, the Mitzvah, needs healing. And, we start evaluating the situation, what I could or can't do, how I could help. When I see somebody struggling, God forbid there are people struggling with addictions, with depression, with any kind of suffering. There's so many people lonely these days who need upliftment. When we uplift them, we too are uplifted. Or I could just think, why should I get involved? I shouldn't interfere. I'm just a poor person. I'm also struggling. I also need upliftment. God says, no, you uplift someone else. You yourself will be uplifted. When you help somebody else out financially, God will help you financially. And so the situation calls for you to do your very best. You might not be the wealthiest. What is it? A smile doesn't cost you anything. And we have to do what we can to help somebody else. What do they say? A friend in need is a friend indeed. Let's be that friend. Let's do what we can. Yes, of course, we could tell ourselves, who am I to get involved? Why should I interfere? Better let the experts, better let the big donors get involved. There's the chev, but you can help. You have ways to help somebody. Whatever it might be, whether it's financial, emotional, psychological, spiritual. A person says, I'm not so religious. How can I get involved? Don't be so humble. Let's get involved. Let's do what we can. The fact is that we're all responsible for each other. And the fact that you have become aware of the situation, what does that teach us? That we have something to contribute, that we have a way to help out. No one can tell you exactly to what degree you have to jump in. Only you know. Only you know how you can help. And that's what's for sure. Each one of us has our struggles, our challenges. We might be poor compared to another person's situation. But when you show that you care about another person, then you are an active, caring member of our community. And God reveals new strengths from deep within. And aser to aser, like the Torah says, when you tithe, when you help others, you yourself will be helped. You yourself will be uplifted. And as they say, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So that's, my friends, the lessons for today. And I hope that we could all learn that by helping others, by helping other people, whatever way you can, we become wealthy in that sense. And God helps us when we help others. How does that expression go? God helps those who help themselves. Oh, we're rephrasing that today. God helps those who help others. With that, we conclude today's lesson. Just on time, 11 o'clock. Any questions before we go? Come on, don't all be so shy. Okay, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, we'll resume tomorrow morning, please God. Look forward to see you all here, same time, same place. Classroom opens 10 o'clock, and we will start the shir at approximately 10:05. See you then. Sei gesund.
Thank you.
What a pleasure.
Thank you, Rabbi. Sei gesund.
It's a pleasure. Sei gesund, everyone.
Chodesh
Chodesh